Hello and welcome. In this video, we're going to talk about a new feature that goes hand in hand with the new group queues. This is the idea of a default palette. What a default palette is it's a palette that can be applied to any fixture. It's a palette that can only contain a single value in the sense that it will only contain a set of values for the attributes within it for one fixture technically. However, that one set of values can be applied to any fixture. This is extremely useful for things like color and beam palettes. It can be used for position palettes in some interesting ways, which we'll get into a little bit later in the video. But to get started, the first thing we're going to do is we have a new show here. I'm going to go into setup and I'm going to make sure that I have group queues enabled. I'm going to set it to prefer group queues. And then we need to patch some fixtures. So we can come in here. We'll just patch some spots real fast. We'll grab our Maverick MK2 spots. And we'll patch 10 of those. We'll also patch some washes. So we'll come in here and maybe we'll try a different set of fixtures. We'll do Mac auras in their standard mode. In here, I've had it create all of the stock palettes that it's going to create. We're going to get rid of those for today's example because we don't want them getting in the way of seeing what we're doing. So we're just going to remove all of these. Alternatively, you could turn off auto palette when you patch the fixtures, and it would not create those. Now that we have a clean slate, we can start showing you how these default palettes work and how they work between different fixture types. So to get started, we're going to grab our spots, we'll turn them on. And to start, we're going to use color as an example here. Remember, palettes are all the same, whether they're position, beam, color, intensity. So they are going to work the same no matter which one of those windows you're in. We're just going to use color as a simple example. With group queues turned on, if I were to come in here and create a custom color, and then record that as a color palette, call that my green. If we view this palette, the desk is going to automatically create it as a default palette. It will pull either an average value or an assumed value from these values within the queue and create the default palette line. In color's example, it can also pull the CIE or the XY data from the color picker. Now this is dependent on your fixture having the emitter data to be able to properly use the color picker, but it's going to try. And you'll see that represented up here. Here's the color, the name, and then the CIE XY values. Now normally, if I wanted to move this color without group queues and without default palettes over to my washes, I would have to do something like copy the programmer, copy the value, move it from one to the other, and then update my palette. But because this contains information as a default palette, all I have to do is select my fixtures and click the palette. And it's going to use that default palette information to make my washes, in this example, become the same color. Now, of course, it's dependent on, again, the CIE value, the emitter information, and some other things. And of course, remember, every fixture renders color differently. So is it going to be exact? Probably not, but it will get you within the ballpark and allow you to start adjusting from there. Now, of course, if we decide we want to adjust this color, in this case, I have white in here that I didn't have previously. We might want to take the white out. And then we may want to adjust the color, touch it up. Once we do that, we can, of course, update this palette just like any other palette. We hit record, touch the palette. And what that's going to do is it's going to put that information in there. There's also a much faster way to put that information in there. If we started with a new fixture and a new color, so we'll start with our washes. We'll go to color. And we will create a custom color here. We do something like that. Once we record this palette, remember, by default, with group queues enabled, it's going to make a default palette line for it. Call this my lavender. So we'll view the palette. Again, it's created that information for me. What I can do is I can come in here. I can go up to the top here and I can say expand heads. By hitting expand heads, it's going to put these default values in for every fixture currently patched in the desk. So it's basically going to include those new heads. Now, some things might not come out right. You see color 1 is set to mix RGB. Currently, this is at red. We would want to change that. Otherwise, we'd have our red color with our color wheel, and that obviously wouldn't come out right. So it's going to guess the best it can based off the values. Obviously, this is one of the worst case scenarios because we're going from RGBW to CMY with a color wheel. One has CTO, one doesn't. So it's going to guess on some of that stuff, and you may need to touch it up. But remember, these work just like regular palettes. So now, if we turn both sets of fixtures on, and we choose that color, it's going to get us, again, close. Remember, keep in mind that every fixture renders color differently. Some colors we have emitter data for, some we don't. Again, in this case, the aura has white and the spot does not. So again, it will get you close. And again, if you want to touch this up, you absolutely can by going to color. We can make a minor adjustment here. Get us a little closer to the lavender that we want on the spots. And once we're happy with that, we update this just like any other palette. And you'll see the update and the values have changed. So the idea behind this is the ability to create and use every palette for any fixture and give you a stepping off point to allow you to use those palettes anywhere you want. You don't have to constantly add new fixtures into your palettes just because you patch some new fixtures. You don't have to constantly update and expand palettes to include those new fixtures. You're not copying programmer data back and forth. Now, as I mentioned earlier, we will go over some of the ways you can use this with position. So if I were to grab my fixtures and write a handful of position palettes containing just pan and tilt, I can come in here and I can tilt my fixtures out, and we can record a low tilt position. We can tilt them out a little more. We can record that as a medium tilt position. We can tilt them out a little bit more. We'll call this a high tilt position. And then from here, we can do a left and a right. So we'll clear out, grab our fixtures again, put them at full. Now, when I'm doing this in this example, I'm being very careful to only include pan or tilt into these. How you do it is up to you, whatever information you think you need in there. So we'll make our left position. And we'll mirror that and make our right position. So now what I've created is a series of position palettes with pan and tilt for low, mid, high, left, and right. This is very similar to what you see auto created, where you have up, down, far down, and things like that. I'm just showing you creating it manually. If we view this palette, you'll see that we have default information in here for pan. And as we flip through our palettes, you'll see that now we have it for tilt as well. What this means is if I were to again grab both of these fixtures and tell both of them to tilt medium or tilt high or tilt pan left or pan right, I would get that. Now remember, it's using a default value, so the default value versus the pan and tilt angles available within the fixtures means they may not be accurate. If you look here, you see that maybe our washes are not quite tilted or panned all the way over. Again, that's just a byproduct of every fixture being different. What you can do with these afterwards is you can start creating more palettes out of them or more positions out of them. Now, in this case, I would want to include my auras into these using those default values, because right now, if I click my auras, you see I can run all of them to the same spot, but if I was to do something like even odd, they're not going to work. So I would want to come in here and view palettes, and we would want to say expand heads. We can flip through each one of these palettes and expand the heads within all of those. That's going to include our auras in the palette at the default value. And now I could do something like tilt the lights up a little bit. use something like even odd to say left and even odd to say right. And then we can record that as a new position. Call this X1. And then if we wanted to, again, we can go even odd. We can go left, tap it again and go right. And we can record that as X2. So now we've just created two different palettes from our palettes with our default palettes. And we really only had to actually program position for one set of lights. So as I mentioned, this will work with existing patched fixtures as well as newly patched fixtures. So if we were to come into our patch, choose a new head, this time we'll choose a Roby and we'll do a BMFL. We'll patch our BMFLs. Quickly, I will just move those down so we see them in a different spot than our other fixtures. There we go. So now with those new fixtures there, we can now, right away, without having to program anything, we can tilt them low, we can tilt them mid, high, left, and right. We can make them all the same green, and we can make them all the same lavender. Again, this makes programming that much easier. Now, some of our stuff like our X1 and X2 here are not going to be created automatically because remember, a default palette is only going to use one value. So what we would want to do here is we would want to expand these palettes again. So we can go view palette, we can come out here, we can say expand heads. And we can do this for each of our palettes. We get our new fixtures to have their own information in there. So default palettes, again, it's a tool that goes hand in hand with group queues. It makes programming that much easier. It means you don't have to program everything into every palette, and it makes it very easy to eventually incorporate that information into every palette. Because remember, once you create it, you can come up here, we can say expand heads, and now you see that our BMFLs are part of this palette now. So I hope you can find this useful. It's kind of a little bit of the under the hood thinking of how the group queues are starting to manage data for you and things like that. But it's good to know that it's there, and it's good to know how it works so you can use it to your advantage and make your life that much easier while programming. As always, you can find us at www.camsasliding.com.